He woke up expecting to die. His name was Barabbas, and before the sun went down that day, he would become the only human being in the whole of history who could point at the cross of Jesus of Nazareth and say, in the flattest administrative sense the words will bear, "That was my execution. That was my hour. Those were my nails." And nobody knows how he died. Not one ancient source in 2,000 years records it. Start with the morning. Somewhere in Jerusalem, in a holding room cut into limestone below the level of the street, a man condemned for insurrection and murder woke on the morning of a Passover and understood what the day held for him. Rome did not keep men like him alive for long. The stone would have been cold, and stone holds cold in that city long after the sun clears the eastern ridge. Outside, above him, the sound would already have been building. Thousands of pilgrims moving toward the temple. The bleating of lambs driven up through the gates. The low, continuous roar of a city swollen to several times its size. And beneath all of it, the smell of the altar, which never went out. He knew what Rome did to men like him. He had almost certainly watched it done. And then, at some hour of that morning, a Roman prefect stood on a raised platform in the open air, said something to a crowd, and this man walked out of custody and into the street. Alive. Not pardoned in some abstract legal sense. Released. Physically, bodily, into a city he could disappear into within 100 paces. So what happened to him? Here is the honest answer, and it is the reason this story is almost never told properly. Nobody knows, not Josephus, who wrote thousands of pages on exactly this period and exactly this kind of man. Not a single Roman document. Not one of the church fathers, who preserved traditions about almost everyone else in the Passion narrative. Not the rabbis. After the gate closed behind him, Barabbas leaves the historical record entirely and never returns. But the silence is not where the investigation stops. Because we know precisely what Barabbas was, and we know, in extraordinary and documented detail, what happened to every single man who was what he was. That is where we are going. But first we have to establish who was standing on that pavement, because even his name is not what most people think it is. Barabbas is not a name. It is a patronymic. In Aramaic, Bar Abba means simply son of the father. Calling a man Barabbas tells you no more about him than calling a man Johnson. It is a label, not an identity. And it means that the majority text of the New Testament does not preserve this man's given name at all, except that it may. At Matthew 27, verses 16 and 17, a substantial body of ancient manuscripts reads something startling. Not Barabbas, Jesus Barabbas. The reading appears in Codex Coridathi. In the group of manuscripts, scholars label Family 1, in the Sinaitic Syriac, and in Armenian and Georgian witnesses. It is not a fringe curiosity. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, knew the reading and commented on it directly, observing that nowhere else in Scripture does a sinner bear the name Jesus, which reads very much like a scholar noticing that copyists had been quietly removing something they found intolerable. Modern critical editions of the Greek New Testament print the name in brackets. Both the English Standard Version and the New International Version carry it in a footnote. And many textual critics regard it as likely original, on a simple principle. A scribe might well delete the name of Jesus from a condemned murderer, but no scribe on earth would add it. If that reading is correct, and it is a live scholarly position, not a settled fact, then the scene changes shape entirely. A Roman prefect stood before a Passover crowd and offered them a choice between 2 men, and both of them were called Jesus. Jesus Barabbas, son of the Father, and Jesus of Nazareth, who had spent 3 years calling God his Father. Now set the stage around him, because the date matters. The emperor was Tiberius. The governor of Judea was Pontius Pilate, and his correct title is Prefect, not Procurator. We know this with certainty because of a block of limestone pulled out of the theater at Caesarea Maritima in 1961 by Antonio Frova's Italian expedition, where it had been reused as a building step. The inscription carries Pilate's name and the title Prefectus. Judea's governors were only retitled Procurator later, under Claudius. When Tacitus calls Pilate a procurator in his Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, he is writing 80 years after the fact and using the vocabulary of his own day. The high priest was Joseph Caiaphas, appointed around the year 18 and holding the office until roughly 36, an unusually long tenure that tells you he had learned how to work with Rome. His father-in-law Annas remained the real power behind the position. As for the year itself, we do not know it. The crucifixion falls somewhere in the interval between the years 30 and 33, with serious scholarship defending both ends of that range. Anyone who tells you the exact date is telling you more than the evidence supports. What we can say is that the city was full. Estimates of the resident population run from Joachim Jeremias's 25 to 30,000 up to Magen Broshi's 40,000, and the ancient figures implying millions of pilgrims are not credible. What is not disputed is the direction of the change. At Passover, the city swelled enormously. The slopes outside the walls filled with pilgrim camps, and Pilate came up from his coastal capital specifically to be present, bringing troops with him, because festivals were when Judea broke. Which brings us to what Barabbas actually did. Every English translation you have ever read has probably softened it. He is called a robber, a thief, a bandit. The Greek word John uses in chapter 18, verse 40, is lestes, and to understand what that word carried, you have to know who else used it. Josephus uses it constantly. He uses it for armed insurgents. He uses it for the followers of Judas the Galilean, for the bandit chieftains of the Judean hills, for the men who would eventually burn Jerusalem down from the inside. It is not the word for a man who steals purses. It is the word an establishment historian uses for revolutionaries he despises. And the Gospels are perfectly explicit about the charge. Mark, in chapter 15, verse 7, says Barabbas was in prison with men who had committed murder during an uprising. Luke, in chapter 23, verse 19, says the same: insurrection in the city and murder. This was not a burglar. This was a man who had taken up arms against Roman occupation, and people had died. The uprising itself has vanished from the record. Mark writes about it as though his readers know which one he means, and we do not. Judea in this period produced a great many such incidents, and Josephus preserves only the ones that were large enough to require legions. But we know where that current came from. In the year 6, when Rome deposed Herod's son Archelaus and took direct control of Judea, the legate Quirinius conducted a census for taxation. A Galilean named Judas rose in revolt against it, arguing that to pay the tax was to accept a master other than God. Josephus describes the movement in his Antiquities, Book 18, Chapter 1, and in the Jewish War, Book 2. He calls it a fourth philosophy, alongside the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. It was crushed. It did not disappear. It went into the hills and became a permanent condition of Judean life for the next 60 years. Barabbas was a son of that movement. Perhaps literally, we cannot know, but certainly in the sense that mattered. So how does a man like that walk free? the Gospels say Pilate released him under a custom. At the feast, the governor freed one prisoner whom the crowd requested. And here, honesty requires a pause, because this is one of the genuinely contested points in the whole Passion narrative. No Roman legal text establishes any annual Passover amnesty in Judea. None. The custom is unattested outside the Gospels themselves. What we do have is one close parallel and one certainty. The parallel is an Egyptian papyrus from the year 85, in which a Roman prefect tells a defendant outright that he is releasing him to the crowds. The certainty is that Roman law gave a governor the power to free whomever he liked, whenever he chose. Whether he did it every Passover in Jerusalem is where the scholarship divides. Raymond Brown treats a local practice as plausible, Helen Bond treats the annual custom as a narrative construction, and this channel does not resolve what the evidence cannot. The four Gospels disagree about who proposed the choice and about how hard Pilate resisted it. And those differences are real. We name them rather than smoothing them, because a reconstruction that harmonizes everything is one you should not trust. But they agree completely on the outcome, and Luke states it in the barest grammar available. He released the man imprisoned for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over to their will. Let me stop the narrative here for a moment, because this next question is one I would genuinely like you to answer. Barabbas walked away from something he had earned. He did not petition for it. He did not deserve it in any sense a court would recognize. And as far as any record shows, he never had to explain to anyone why he was still breathing. Have you ever walked away from something you should not have walked away from? A consequence that landed somewhere else. A cost somebody else absorbed quietly without telling you, and you only understood it years later, or never fully did. Tell me in the comments, not the tidy version. I read them, and this particular question tends to bring out the ones I remember. Because that is the position this man occupied, and it is worth sitting inside it before we follow him out of the gate. Now, the gate. Try to stand where he stood. A Roman governor gave judgment from a raised platform, a bema on a paved forecourt, in the open air, in front of people. John describes exactly this in chapter 19, verse 13, which forecourt is still disputed. Most scholars now favor Herod's palace on the western hill over the traditional site. But the physical sequence is not in doubt. Soldiers who had been holding him for execution took the irons off him. That is the first thing that happens to a released prisoner. And it happens in front of everyone. He would have been filthy, in the undyed wool tunic he was arrested in, and he would have come up out of a dark room into direct Passover sunlight, which on the Judean ridge in spring is bright enough to blind a man for several seconds. And then he had to walk through the crowd. Not past it. Through it. The same crowd. People who had shouted for him by name and people who had not. Priests who had worked to arrange it. Pilgrims from Alexandria and Babylon who had no idea what they had just watched. And somewhere in that press, the family and the followers of the man who was taking his place, close enough to touch him. Nobody stopped him. Nobody could. He had the whole city in front of him at the busiest hour of its busiest week, and he could have been 3 streets away in 90 seconds. We do not know whether he took them. We know only that he walked out through a crowd, and that within a few hours, on a low rise outside the northwestern wall, 3 men were crucified, and 2 of them were called by the same word that had been used for him. Mark, chapter 15, verse 27. 2 lestai, 1 on each side. Luke calls them criminals, and records one of them saying that the 2 of them were receiving what their actions deserved, which under Roman rule in Judea points at sedition, not theft. Theft did not carry crucifixion. Which raises a possibility the text does not confirm, but strongly suggests. Mark said Barabbas was imprisoned with the rebels who had committed murder in the uprising. If the men on those two crosses were his own companions, and it is difficult to construct a more natural reading, then there were 3 insurgents scheduled to die that morning, and the third one was standing somewhere in Jerusalem, free, while the other 2 died on either side of a man who had taken his place in the middle. And here is the detail that ought to stay with you. Of the 3 men in Barabbas's own custody group, the only one whose outcome Scripture actually records is the one who stayed on his cross. Luke, chapter 23, verses 40 to 43. One of them turns, acknowledges the justice of his own sentence, asks to be remembered, and receives a promise for that same day. The man who was released got nothing. No promise, no scene, no word. He got his life, and then the record closes over him. If you want to know what he escaped in physical terms, archaeology can tell you. In 1968, at Givat ha-Mivtar in northern Jerusalem, Vasilios Tsafaris excavated an ossuary containing the bones of a man named Yehohanan. Driven through his heel bone was an iron nail, bent at the tip where it had struck a knot, with a fragment of olive wood still adhering to it. It remains the only skeletal evidence of a first-century crucifixion ever recovered. That nail is what Barabbas did not receive. So he stepped into the street. And the world he stepped into has a documented history, a very precise one, and it runs for exactly 40 years. Start with the 2 men who had decided his case. Within about 6 years, both were finished. In the year 36, Pilate broke up a gathering of Samaritans assembling at Mount Gerizim, killing a number of them, and the resulting complaint reached the legate of Syria, Vitellius, who ordered him back to Rome to answer for it. Josephus records this in Antiquities, Book 18, Chapter 4. Pilate leaves the historical record at that point, and everything you may have heard about his suicide or exile comes from later Christian legend, not from any source of the period. Vitellius then deposed Caiaphas from the high priesthood in the same period. Sit with the shape of that for a moment. The prefect who signed the order and the high priest who engineered it were both out of office within a few years. Barabbas, if he was alive, outlasted both of them. There was one brief interruption. A native king, Agrippa I, from the year 41 to 44, and then direct Roman government returned and never lifted again. And now the pattern begins in earnest. Around the year 45, a man named Judas gathered a following at the Jordan, promising to divide the river by a sign. The procurator Cuspius Fadus sent cavalry. Judas was beheaded, and his followers scattered. Josephus, Antiquities, Book 20, Chapter 5. Then, 2 or 3 years later, the hardest single fact in this entire story, the procurator Tiberius Julius Alexander, an Alexandrian Jew who had abandoned the faith of his people, and, remarkably, a nephew of the philosopher Philo, ordered the crucifixion of 2 men named James and Simon. Their identity is recorded plainly. They were the sons of Judas the Galilean. Josephus, Antiquities, Book 20, Chapter 5. The sons of the man who founded the movement. Crucified. On exactly the kind of cross Barabbas had been scheduled for, by exactly the authority that had scheduled it, roughly 15 years after he walked away from his. If Barabbas went back to the movement, and we do not know that he did, those were the heirs of his commanders, and he would have heard about it. Famine struck Judea in the same window, recorded in Acts chapter 11 and in Josephus. And under the procurator Felix in the 50s, the situation deteriorated past recovery. Josephus writes that insurgents were crucified in numbers too large to count, and a new development appeared, the Sicarii, the dagger men, who murdered in broad daylight inside festival crowds with short blades concealed under their cloaks, then joined the outcry of horror around the body. Their victims included Jonathan, a former high priest, killed inside the temple precincts. Then an Egyptian prophet led a crowd out to the Mount of Olives, promising the walls of Jerusalem would fall at his command. Roman troops dispersed them with slaughter. And this is where the New Testament itself measures the distance traveled. In Acts chapter 21, verse 38, Paul is arrested in Jerusalem amid a riot, and the Roman tribune's first question is whether he is the Egyptian who led 4,000 men of the Sicarioi out into the wilderness. Read that again. Roughly 25 years after Barabbas walked free, the default assumption of a Roman officer encountering an unidentified Jewish man causing a disturbance in Jerusalem was that he had captured an insurgent commander. That is how completely the movement had taken over the country. In the year 66, it went off entirely. A man named Menahem, of the family of Judas the Galilean, the same bloodline, 60 years on, broke open the armory at the fortress of Masada, armed his followers, and entered Jerusalem at the head of them. The high priest Ananias was hunted down and killed. Menahem himself was seized shortly afterward by a rival faction of insurgents, tortured and executed. Josephus, Jewish War, Book 2, Chapter 17. The movement was now killing Judea's own high priests and then killing each other. Which brings us to the year 70, and to the question of whether Barabbas lived to see it. We should be careful here, so let me be exact about what can and cannot be said. If Barabbas was somewhere between 20 and 30 years old at his release, he would have been between roughly 57 and 72 in the year 70. Ancient life expectancy figures are misleading because they are driven downward by infant mortality. A man who reached 30 in the 1st century had a reasonable prospect of reaching 60. So the honest statement is this: he was young enough that living to see the end was possible. Not that he did. We have no idea. But this is the end he was walking toward when he stepped off that pavement. Titus surrounded Jerusalem and built a wall of circumvallation around the entire city. A wall whose purpose was not to keep enemies out, but to keep the population in and to starve them. Josephus, who was there, describes what happened to those who tried to slip out to forage. They were caught, scourged, and crucified in sight of the walls at a rate he gives as up to 500 a day, until, in his words, there was no space left for the crosses and no crosses left for the bodies. That is Jewish war. Book 5, Chapter 11. 500 a day, on the same hills, under the same authority, for the same offense. The temple burned, the city was demolished, and 3 or 4 years later, the last holdouts under Eleazar ben Yair, a kinsman of Menahem, died on the rock of Masada, which Yigael Yadin excavated in the 1960s. The famous speech Josephus gives Eleazar there is a literary composition in the classical manner, not a transcript, and should be treated as such. The fall itself is not in doubt. That is the road. That is where it goes. So, what happened to Barabbas? There are 3 possibilities, and I am going to name all 3 and refuse to choose, because choosing would require me to invent evidence that does not exist. The first, he went back. He returned to the movement that had defined him, and he ended the way its members ended, on a cross outside a wall, or in a hill village burned by auxiliaries, or on the rock at Masada with the last of them. This is the likeliest reading of a man's character, and it is pure speculation. The second, he withdrew. Something in that morning broke the thing in him that had picked up a weapon, and he went somewhere quiet and grew old, and told nobody, and died in a bed. Also speculation. The third is the one you have probably heard, and it needs to be named for what it is. The story that Barabbas became a follower of Jesus, that he wandered, tormented, and eventually came to faith, has no ancient source whatsoever. Not one. It comes from a novel published in 1950 by the Swedish writer Per Lagerkvist, and from the film made from it in 1961. It is a fine piece of fiction. It is not history, and it has been repeated from pulpits for 70 years as though it were. The record is silent. Everything else is us, filling the silence with what we would prefer. But the silence itself is saying something, and it is worth hearing. Consider what the Torah says about the transaction that saved him. Numbers chapter 35, verses 31 to 33, is unambiguous. You shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer, because blood pollutes the land, and the land cannot be cleansed of blood except by the blood of the one who shed it. By the standard of the law itself, what happened that morning was not permitted. A murderer was ransomed. The exchange was not lawful. And that is not a problem to be explained away. That is the entire point. And it is the thing that makes this episode so much sharper than a comfortable sermon about substitution. Grace, when it appears in this story, appears as a violation of the statute. Somebody had to absorb that. Caiaphas, of all people, had already stated the logic out loud. In John chapter 11, verses 49 and 50, arguing before the council, he says it is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. John adds, dryly, that he was saying more than he understood. The high priest articulated the exchange before he arranged it. And then it happened literally, to a specific man, with a name, in a specific building, on a morning we can almost date. There is a pattern behind it that a Jewish crowd would have recognized immediately, because they had watched it performed every year of their lives. Leviticus chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. 2 goats are brought and presented together before the assembly. Lots are cast. One is killed, the other is released alive, sent away bearing the guilt of the people, out beyond the camp, and permitted to live. 2 brought together, a choice made before the assembly. One dies. One walks away alive. The roles are inverted. In Leviticus, the released animal carries the guilt away, while in Jerusalem the released man carried nothing at all, and the one who died carried everything. But no one standing on that pavement, watching a prefect present 2 men and a crowd choose between them at a festival, would have missed the shape of it. Isaiah had described the arrangement 7 centuries earlier in chapter 53, verse 12. Numbered with the transgressors, and it was fulfilled not as poetry, but as scheduling. 3 crosses were prepared for 3 insurgents. 1 insurgent was withdrawn, and a different man was inserted into the middle position. Mark 15:27 is simply reporting the logistics. And there are 2 more sentences you should know about, both spoken before Barabbas was released, and both fulfilled in the history we have just walked through. The first was spoken in a garden, in the dark, hours earlier, to a disciple who had drawn a sword during the arrest. All who take the sword will perish by the sword. Matthew chapter 26, verse 52. In context, that is not a proverb. It is a statement made to an armed man during a night arrest in a province where armed men were dying on crosses continuously. It is the most compressed description of the Lestes outcome anywhere in the New Testament. And it was spoken on the same night that a Lestes was released to go back to it. The second was spoken a few days earlier, on the descent from the Mount of Olives, and Luke records it in chapter 19, verses 41 to 44. Weeping over the city, Jesus describes enemies throwing up a barricade around it, surrounding it, hemming it in, and leaving not one stone upon another. Then Josephus, 40 years later, describes Titus's wall of circumvallation doing precisely that. I will note honestly that some scholars read the specificity of Luke's wording as evidence the passage was composed after the year 70. That debate exists, and you should know it exists. But whichever way that question falls, the outcome does not change. The city Barabbas was released into was destroyed within his possible lifetime, and everything he had fought for went into the fire with it. Which leaves you. Because here is what makes this man impossible to file away as a historical curiosity. Every other claim about substitution is theological. Yours is theological. Mine is. His was clerical. A name was struck off a list and another name was written in its place, in ink, by a Roman clerk on an ordinary morning, and a man who had killed people walked out into the sunshine while somebody else went to the place prepared for him. And the thing that ought to unsettle you is not his gratitude. It is that we have no evidence he felt any. He did not ask for it. He did not earn it. He may not have understood it. And as far as history can tell, he never changed because of it. He simply received it entirely, undeservedly, and then walked off into a silence so complete that 2,000 years of searching have not turned up one line about how he died. If you have quietly concluded that whatever mercy exists in this world was intended for better people than you, for people who responded properly, who were transformed on schedule, who deserved the thing they were given, then Barabbas is standing in your way. He is the counter-example. The first person to receive what the cross was for was a violent man who gave nothing back and left no record of caring. So here is the question I want to leave you holding, and I am not going to answer it for you. If you were released, and no one ever asked you to explain why, would you have gone back to the life you were arrested for? Think about that honestly before you answer, because it is not a rhetorical question, and it does not have an obvious answer. If there is someone in your life who needs to hear this today, someone who has decided they are past the reach of it, send them this. That is what this is for. And if you want to keep walking through this century with us, stay. There is far more of it. The men on either side of him, the governor who let him go, and then vanished from the record himself, the city that had 40 years left and did not know it. Subscribe, and we will go there next. Barabbas woke up expecting to die, and he did not. We do not know what he did with the rest of his life, but we know he had one.